Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now, sometimes when I start a project, I have a pretty clear idea in mind of what I want the finished piece to look like. But sometimes, like now, I start a project with one clear idea and somewhere in the middle get caught up in all the small details and, well, the finished product just doesn't end up looking like I had intended. So without further ado, here's a project that started with one plan in mind and ended up looking like something completely different. So let's get to it. To get started, I grabbed a 2x4 and cut it into two pieces, one at 16 inches and the other at 24. Now these dimensions aren't all that important since it's always best to go with what's most visually pleasing, but I figured I'd mention it in case you were wondering. The next thing I needed to do was to mark out the center of the shorter piece, as well as the width and half the depth of the wood, since I'll be using a half lap joint to put the cross together. I'll explain more about that later. After marking the board, I placed it onto the longer piece to help determine where I want them to overlap and marked it off, just as I did with the shorter piece. Then it was time to grab my circular saw and get to cutting. A half lap joint is where two pieces of wood have half their thickness removed by way of these small cuts, which are then removed so that they fit into one another. Now this half lap joint was also where I made my first misstep. In a ghost town or old western cemetery, they likely wouldn't have made their crosses this way. They would have taken a few nails, laid one board over the other, and hammered them together. So by trying to get a little fancy, I've moved one step away from my original idea. Although this is a great technique for joining two boards together. Now that my cross is assembled, it's time to give it some instant aging, and for that I'll be using a wire wheel and my drill. You'll also want to wear a respirator for this. The wire wheel, when moved in the direction of the wood grain, helps to give it a worn texture and makes the darker grain patterns stand out. Now this tends to happen naturally, so this technique just helps to speed up the process. It was at this point I realized my second misstep. I should have made the edges of the cross more jagged. The freshly cut board ends look too perfect and it pushes it another step away from my original idea, although I could always go back and do it later. The next step in this process was to give it some char with a propane torch. And here's where I'm at, but I think it's a bit too dark in some areas, so I'm going to fire up the wire wheel again and give it a bit more tonal variation. If you didn't want to use the torch method, you could stain the wood, and my friends Hollywood Haunter have a great video on the process, and I'll link it down in the video description. Now, like any good grave marker, this one needs a name, so I grabbed a marker, traced out a name, and got to carving with my rotary tool. And that brings me to strike 3. My original idea was to do a crisscross wrap around the center with some aged sisal rope, which I had picked up for this project and then completely forgot about until after I finished carving the name. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Because I am. I'm caught up thinking about all the small details and it's distracted me from the original idea. But now that I've thoroughly changed course, it's time to bring it home with some nails. I've cut these nails down to 1/2-inch pieces, which will then get glued into place. To make it easier, I'll drill some pilot holes before applying some glue and setting them in. Then I'll mix up a bit of burnt umber and orange acrylic paint to give them a rusty appearance. The final thing I'll do, since this looks a bit too dark and not as sun-bleached as my original idea, is to mix up a bit of white paint with a drop or two of brown and some water to create a light wash that will get sprayed over the entire piece. This should help lighten the tone of the wood and give it a more aged look. Now, while this isn't the prop I intended on making, it's a good reminder that even the most experienced of us can get caught up in the small details and sometimes need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.